Hello, this is the character known as Jules. In this video, I'm going to attempt to use logic and external methods to confirm and model a phenomenon that I both experience and feel like I know through gnosis. First, to define a couple of terms. What do I mean by consciousness progression? If this term is completely new to you, you might want to check out my beginner video titled What are Consciousness Progression and Spiral Dynamics? Possibly also my Lines of Development video, both of which are in a playlist specifically on consciousness progression and spiral dynamics, which I will link in the description so you can peruse it at your leisure. For the purposes of this video specifically, I'm talking about a fairly broad definition of consciousness progression. Progression of any developmental line, for example, a skill, an intelligence, an area of life, at any level of scope, for example, an individual person, a company, a culture, or all of humanity. What do I mean by exponential? We have a natural tendency to assume that growth will be additive, in other words, linear. If it takes you 10 seconds to add one Lego block to a tower, then you can assume that after 30 seconds, you will have added 3 blocks. After 10 seconds, you have 1 block. After 20 seconds, you have 2 blocks. After 30 seconds, you have 3 blocks. This is additive growth. At each step of 10 seconds, you add 1 block. When you draw it on a graph, it's a nice straight line. That's why it's called linear growth. However, not all growth works that way. In multiplicative growth, also called exponential growth, instead of simply being added at each step, there is something being multiplied at each step. For example, if there is a rule that any cell will always divide itself into 2 cells at a constant rate of 1 division per hour, and you start with 1 cell, then, after 1 hour, that first starting cell has split into 2 cells. After 2 hours, each of those 2 cells have split, and you now have 4 cells. After 3 hours, those 4 cells have doubled to 8 cells, etc. The function for this process could be written as n of x equals 2 to the x, where n is the number of cells and x is the number of hours. That x being placed as an exponent on the right side of the equation, in this case an exponent to 2, makes this an exponential function, hence why this is called exponential growth. So, the number of cells at 1 hour is n of 1, which is 2 to the 1, which equals 2 cells. The number of cells at 2 hours is n of 2, which is 2 to the 2, which is 4 cells. The number of cells at 3 hours is n of 3, which is 2 to the 3, which is 8 cells, etc. When you draw this on a graph, it appears as a curve that starts out shallow, but then rapidly gets steeper and steeper. The shallow part of our function is 1 hour, 2 cells, 2 hours, 4 cells, 3 hours, 8 cells. This part doesn't really look that different from linear growth, which is why this beginning part of an exponential growth process can often be mistaken for a linear growth process. But if you're expecting linear growth, the next part can come as a real shock. In linear growth, you can look at the past as a simple and pretty reliable guide for the future. If over the last 30 seconds you added 3 Lego blocks, then over the next 30 seconds, unless something interrupts you, you can reasonably expect to add 3 more Lego blocks for a total of 6 at the 60-second mark. However, if what you've got is exponential growth, and over the last 3 hours you got 7 more cells in addition to your starting single cell for a total of 8 cells. Then over the next 3 hours, you're not going to just get 7 more cells for a total of 15 cells. Instead, at the 6-hour mark, you're going to suddenly have 64 cells, since at 4 hours, the 8 cells that you had have doubled to 16 cells. At 5 hours, those 16 cells have doubled to 32 cells. And at 6 hours, the 32 cells have doubled to 64. And let me draw your attention to the fact that these two graphs show the same number of steps. They both have 6 steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is the impact of the difference between exponential versus linear growth. If you're expecting linear growth, 7 additional cells for a total of 15, then hitting 64 cells at only 6 hours is going to look like absolutely astonishing growth that came out of nowhere. This sudden departure from what could appear to be linear growth is called hockey sticking, because the graph looks a bit like a hockey stick. You can see the apparent exponential growth rate of consciousness progression evidenced in the history of humanity. In very rough terms, we started beige at about 150,000 years ago or more, purple at 50,000 years ago, red 10,000 years ago, blue 5,000 years ago, orange about 350 years ago with the Age of Enlightenment, green 60 years ago, and by some estimates, we're hitting yellow right about now. Now we've got a hockey stick lying on its back. But there's an assumption built into this graph. The assumption is that each of these stages represents an equal amount of consciousness development. It's like we're assuming that each stage covers exactly 1 unit of consciousness. What if we're simply defining the stages of consciousness progression such that it looks like exponential growth? We tend to see things closer to us in more detail. So maybe we've simply chosen to define more stages toward the later end of consciousness progression, the part that's most recent for us. In other words, maybe our rate of consciousness progression is linear after all. And the more frequent stages that we've defined at the later end of consciousness progression represent less consciousness growth than the earlier stages. To test whether human consciousness progression really has demonstrated an exponential growth curve, we need a clear measure for consciousness growth that is independent of how we define stages. And if we had that, we could also determine whether each of the stages, as we've defined them, actually represents roughly the same amount of development. One way that the effects of consciousness progression manifest is in an increased capacity to do stuff. In other words, power. So let's look at power level. Trigger warning. I'm about to talk about potentially sensitive topics like human death. If you want to avoid these topics, you can skip this part and go to the chapter titled Perception of Reality and the Self. One pretty clear way to measure power is to assess destructive power. If we can get some clear numbers, that would help a lot with clear measurement. Because of how we tend to examine our histories, we happen to have some pretty clear numbers regarding human deaths. So, to get some clear measurements for each stage, let's look specifically at the number of humans that can be killed in one intentional event. If consciousness progression is linear, and we've simply defined more stages toward the end, then we would expect successive stages to add progressively less destructive capacity with each stage. This might be a progression that looks something like purple can destroy 400 more humans than beige, red can destroy 150 more humans than purple, blue can destroy 25 more humans than red, orange can destroy 20 more humans than blue, etc. If, on the other hand, each stage does in fact add the same amount of destructive capacity, then this would indeed result in a consciousness progression rate that is exponential over time, as our previous assessment of history implied. This might look something like this. Purple can destroy 100 more humans than beige, red can destroy 100 more humans than purple, blue can destroy 100 more humans than red, and orange can destroy 100 more humans than blue, etc. Don't be misled by the fact that this graph looks shorter. The height of the graph doesn't matter. We're looking at the accelerating rate of destructive capacity. If we keep plotting this exponential curve, it very quickly outstrips the linear graph in height. It's the sharpness of that corner in the hockey stick that you want to look out for. That tells you how exponential the curve is, and therefore how shocking things will be if you were expecting a linear progression. So let's find out which graph we have by looking at logical potential numbers for each stage of consciousness. At beige, there isn't proper capacity for organization or planning, so within a single event, we can typically destroy 1 or 2 other humans at a time, maybe a maximum of 10 to 20 people in a rare reactive clash between bands. At purple, it becomes possible to destroy a whole other tribe in an organized event, so potentially hundreds of humans. Once we get to red-blue territory, now we can destroy a whole city or nation. For example, the Roman Republic killed approximately 50,000 Carthaginians when they obliterated Carthage in 146 BC. And then in orange, suddenly we're capable of effectively destroying the planet with a nuclear Armageddon. Hundreds of millions of humans wiped out by the initial nuclear explosions. And that's not even counting the fallout from the resulting nuclear winter, which could raise the death toll to the billions. Wait a second. This is actually demonstrating that each successive stage is more powerful than the one that came before, and at a rate that itself looks exponential. This actually compounds with the exponential rate at which we've been hitting stages. So that would mean that our rate of consciousness progression is even more exponential than it originally looked. Let's see what this graph really looks like. Wow. That is one hell of a hockey stick. It's so severe that it almost looks like a right angle. And remember what we're measuring here. We're tracking a metric of the actual acceleration of humanity's consciousness development over the history of our existence by looking at our capacity to affect our world. But wait, although destructive potential is an easy thing to measure, I see two major limitations to using it as a metric for consciousness development. One, past orange stage, we have significantly decreased destructive tendencies, so it becomes difficult to measure consciousness development this way at green stage and in tier 2. Does this trend of exponential consciousness progression continue through tier 2? 2. Destructive potential is just one small aspect of consciousness development. It's definitely not the whole picture. So, is there something else that we can look at that will show us more of the picture, especially that might help us see whether consciousness development continues to progress exponentially in tier 2? Let's look at what an individual or culture perceives of reality and the self as they progress their consciousness. I'll track 5 aspects: time, space, layers of reality, individual identity, group identity. Beige. Space and time is here and now, immediate needs and dangers. There is no sense of layers of reality. If there are experiences of outer court magical phenomena like non-corporeal beings, they are likely to be conflated with physical phenomena. There really is no identity yet, no self-awareness, and no group identity. There might be a group of people banding together for survival, but they don't have a shared culture yet. Purple. A dimension of time is added. Now there is an awareness of the past, but there's not yet a clear sequence of events in the past. Instead, there is more simply a sense of what was past and a sense of what is present. There is, however, now a basic understanding of cause and effect. A dimension of space is added. Place now has meaning. The experienced world is still pretty small, though, pretty much just wherever you happen to live. Awareness of subtle phenomena becomes more present. Emotions and stories become important. However, if there are experiences of outer court magical phenomena like non-corporeal beings, there still might not be clear differentiation between them and physical reality. A dimension of relationship is added, a sense of us and them. Belonging becomes important. There is now a group identity of approximately family or tribe size. There still isn't a true individual identity yet. Red. This is the first coarse sense of individual identity. It is very physically oriented. Group identity expands to include allies. There is more differentiation in space. Territory becomes important. The experienced world expands. There is a much better understanding of the territories of allies and enemies. There is now a sense of future, but both past and future are still fairly vague, and there is still some tendency to conflate the future with the present. There is more differentiation between gross and subtle phenomena. There may even be a willingness to sacrifice gross well-being in the present for subtle rewards in the future, for example, glory and honor. Blue. The dimension of role is now added to identity. Group identity expands, possibly to city or even nation size, along with the size of the experienced world. Space and time both become much more organized and concrete, although future can still be a bit amorphous. There is now a very clear differentiation between gross and subtle phenomena. Orange. A capacity for logical analysis is acquired, so reality and the self can now be understood to a high degree of sophistication, including both gross and subtle phenomena. Time and space are now both understood with a high degree of detail. The experienced world can be much larger and may even include direct experience of multiple cultures or nations. But future time is still focused on the scale of the individual lifetime. Individual identity takes on much more settled dimensionality. Ideas and feelings become more important. Personal achievement and happiness become strong motivators. All of this is still focused on external physical reality. Group identity becomes much more complex, a network of relationships, potentially even multiple networks, that may now cross the boundaries of profession, class, culture, etc. Mastery of gross reality begins to resonate here, and may be seen to continue to resonate through green and yellow stages. Green. An inner subtle dimensionality opens up, adding a much more sophisticated understanding of the inner life of the self, which allows for an individual identity that is much more unique. Happiness is still a strong motivator, but the solutions sought are much more sophisticated and include inner subtle reality. There begins to be a sense that the self is made up of multiple parts. Group identity expands to include very diverse communities, all of humanity, possibly even non-humans like animals, plants, even whole natural ecosystems or the planet itself. The experienced world tends to be at a global scale here. Time can expand to include a much more intimate experience of both past and future beyond the scope of the individual lifetime. There may be a concern with fixing our perception of the distant past. There may be a concern with helping future generations. Mastery of early subtle may be seen to begin to resonate here and continue into yellow. Where gross is about one aspect of one layer of reality, subtle expands awareness to include many aspects of that one layer of reality. Yellow. In terms of layers of reality, if gross hasn't been mastered yet, there's a high likelihood that it will be here. And yellow stage powerfully resonates with mastery of early subtle, the mental and emotional. The scope of concern with time and space can expand in yellow stage to conceptually include the entire universe through all of its existence. There may be a powerful motivation to develop a unifying theory of everything. Group identity is likely to be at a global scope and highly complex, networks of networks. Individual identity both consciously contains multiple interdependent parts and is now seen as being intimately interdependent with all of its external networks of people. There is likely to be a sense of a life purpose, a role to play as an individual to have a beneficial effect on the world, although it might not be completely clear yet what that role is or how to perform it. Turquoise. Turquoise stage resonates with mastery of late subtle, in other words, outer court magic. The sense of time and space can expand to include a felt experience of the subtle aspects of the entire universe through its entire existence. Individual and group identity are very likely to begin to merge here with a direct felt sense of the group being as much as all of the universe with all of its subtle aspects, and the self being intimately connected to all of it. As this interconnected being, there is likely to now be a much clearer vision of the life purpose. Coral resonates with mastery of early causal, in other words, inner court magic. Where gross is about one aspect of one layer of reality, and subtle includes many aspects of one layer of reality, causal includes many aspects of many layers of reality. Dimensionality is now likely to expand to much more than just the time and space of the manifested layer of reality. It can include direct experiences of many layers of the cosmos, including multiple causal layers, maybe even also the void. Time can be experienced as simply another dimension that can be explored freely, just like any other. Identity is likely to begin to become fractal through all of these layers of reality. There's definitely a sense that the self is more than just the personality of this one lifetime. Teal resonates with mastery of late causal, in other words, base principles of reality. There is likely to be an intimately felt, direct, and persistent experience of the infinite and continuous something of the cosmos. Time and space merge into a continuous, infinite dimensionality. Identity and perceived reality have a tendency to start merging as well, such that the self can be experienced as being much bigger, possibly even infinite. Plum resonates deeply with witnessing stage, fundamental opposites. There is likely to be an intimately felt, direct, and persistent experience of the infinite void as distinct from the infinite something. Time is the infinite now. Any other time is illusory. Space is the infinite here. Any other space is illusory. Identity is infinite pure awareness. Anything else is not the true self. Aubergine resonates deeply with non-dual stage. The fundamental opposites become not two. For example, the infinite something and the infinite nothing, void, self and not self. One could say that this is a direct and abiding experience of undifferentiated infinite infinities. Yep, that still looks like an exponential progression in development. And remember, this compounds with the exponential rate of development that we looked at over the course of history. So can we make sense of why human consciousness progression would be exponential? First, let's look at how individual consciousness progression might work if left unchecked. By unchecked, I mean that nothing gets in the way of the progression, like, for example, shadows that aren't being dealt with, lack of resources, or the person choosing to hold themselves back. Although even these aren't always successful at slowing down consciousness progression. One way of thinking of this is that each stage of consciousness gives you a set of much more powerful tools than the previous stage. By tools here, I mean everything from techniques and concepts to entire paradigms and worldviews. So you aren't just adding the same amount of power at each step, you're adding a larger amount of power at each step. I'll demonstrate what this can look like with my crochet skill as an example of a developmental line. Beige stage, unawareness. At this stage, I didn't know that crochet was a skill. I may have seen it, but I didn't notice it. My effective power regarding crochet was 0. Purple stage, mastery, or mystery. At this stage, I was watching someone else crochet, my great-grandmother. I could see that she was making yarn turn into objects like clothing, but I didn't have any idea how she was doing it. I wasn't yet trying it myself. So my effective power regarding crochet was slightly more than 0 because I was aware of the skill and I could talk about it a little bit. Red stage, trial and error. At this stage, I could figure out how to make a chain, one long line, but I couldn't figure out how to crochet in 2 dimensions, let alone 3. Nevertheless, I was doing something. I had an effective power of 1 dimension, a line. Blue stage, rule following. Following patterns allowed me to crochet objects in 3 dimensions. I added 2 whole dimensions. but I could only make types of objects that I had patterns for. If I had a pattern for a hat, I could make hats. But if I didn't have a pattern for a sweater, I couldn't make a functional sweater. Orange stage analysis. When I got into orange stage with crochet, I then understood the principles of crochet, why it worked the way that it did. Suddenly, I could invent my own patterns and even my own stitches. I could make infinite types of objects. I added a whole infinity. Green stage psychology. My green stage journey with crochet showed me benefits of crochet that I couldn't have imagined. Now, not only could I make cool physical objects, gross reality, but I was experiencing tremendous benefits in the clarity of my thinking and in my emotional state, subtle reality. I had added a whole new layer of reality. Yellow stage, systems of systems. By the time I got to yellow stage, I got meta with my crochet skill. I now understood the skill of mastering a skill. This made me much faster at learning subsequent skills, which I could apply to infinite skills. I had added yet another infinity. Turquoise stage connection. At this point, there was a big shift in how I saw crochet. I no longer saw pattern pieces. I no longer needed to even write patterns for myself or measure anything. Instead, I saw whole objects in clear and proportionate detail in my mind, and crocheting became more like sculpting. I had access to totally free creative expression. I could also feel what was right to do. I was following a form of inner guidance, although I wouldn't have known to call it that at the time. And I was absolutely performing a kind of outer court magic with my crochet. My crochet objects had effects on the people I gave them to. So I had added another layer of reality. Coral stage, layers of reality. Finally, I got to a point where I felt like I was seeing the universe through crochet. I felt like it was telling me secrets about reality. I have no better way to put it than that. It felt like crochet was giving me direct access to infinity itself. I hope you can see from this how even a single developmental line has an inherent exponential progression. And then if you think about how a person's consciousness progression is really nothing other than a collection of developmental lines, you can see how this would mean that consciousness progression at the individual human level must also therefore be exponential. But then also consider that one developmental line can help boost another. And you can see that at the level of the whole individual, consciousness progression might be even more exponential than at the level of a single developmental line. Taking that a step further, how about at the level of a group of humans? Not only does everything that I said about individual consciousness progression apply here, but also people learn from each other. One person discovers or invents a powerful tool, a technique, concept, paradigm, etc., or even a literal tool, and shares it with other people, their peers, coworkers, employees, students, children, etc., who then gain it much faster than the original person did. Then, having access to this much more powerful tool enables them to discover or invent even more powerful tools. And when you have multiple people doing this stuff, multiple powerful tools get combined and progression just explodes. This is how we had the technological explosion of the 20th century. Additionally, whenever anyone learns or experiences anything, it gets stored in causal reality. So even if a person who discovers or invents something never tells anyone else about it, this information gets recorded in causal reality. And causal reality is where we get our insights and inspirations from, whether consciously or subconsciously. So this information, could absolutely be picked up by someone else, even someone else on the other side of the world. I suspect that this might be a factor in simultaneous invention. For example, Isaac Newton wrote his Fluxional Calculus manuscript in 1669. Leibniz developed his foundation for differential and integral calculus between 1672 and 1675. But Newton's paper wasn't published until 1711, so Leibniz couldn't have known about it. So yes, I believe that consciousness progression is inherently exponential by nature. So if you look at your past year of personal development and you're expecting about the same amount of personal development next year, or if you look at the past 10 years of human consciousness growth and expect about the same amount of consciousness growth over the next 10 years, think again. Consider that, if left unhindered, the actual upcoming growth rate could be shockingly steep.